Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Latham and Watkins Forum, today on immigration and the potential, what is often called a crisis. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Adam Cox. Today, my main job is to stay out of the way so that you all can hear from the absolutely fantastic group of panelists that we're fortunate enough to have with us here today. So I'm going to keep the introductions really short so that we can get into the meat of our conversation. But let me just say a few words about each of them. Andrea Flores, she spent her entire career working to reform the nation's immigration system. She's currently Vice President of Immigration Policy and campaigns at forward.us. She previously led the ACLU's national immigration advocacy work. And she's also managed to work, so far as I can tell, in nearly every arm of the government on immigration reform issues in the Department of Homeland Security, as it implemented the extremely important DACA program, protecting Dreamers from deportation, in the White House under both Presidents Obama and Biden, in the Senate, and as policy director for Hillary Clinton's campaign. To her left, Ahilan Arlanatham, he's been litigating and organizing around immigrants' rights issues for more than 2 decades. He's currently the director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA Law School, and he was previously at the ACLU. He's litigated cases that, among other things, have secured due process rights for immigrants jailed for years while they were fighting their deportation. One, what I think is the first case ever to secure a right to counsel for a group of non-citizens facing removal, and successfully blocked the Trump administration's effort to cancel humanitarian protection for hundreds of thousands of non-citizens in the country. And on the end, Maria Sacchetti, she has covered immigration for more than a decade. First at the Boston Globe, now at the Washington Post. She hitchhiked with a migrant caravan to the border during the Trump administration. And her reporting on the secrecy surrounding the immigration system has led to, among other things, the uncovering of the fact that some immigrants have been stuck in detention for more than 20 years. So I'm grateful that you all could come today to talk about the pressing issues of immigration policy. I think we want to try to do 3 things with enough time left over for questions from you all. So we're going to first try to talk a little bit about just what the current environment is like, both at the border and away from it. What challenges does the system face? Then I think we're going to try to talk a little bit about how we got to the point we're at, like why we're in the mess we're in, to the extent we're in a mess. And then we want to end with some possible optimism. It's easy to be dispirited in these conversations. So we want to talk about what the opportunities are for change and where the openings are where we can have hope. So to start us off, Maria, let me just ask you to help set the stage for us and for the audience. The border is really ever present in conversations about immigration policy today, and it has been in debates for decades. Many politicians, presidential administrations from both parties have described the state of the border as a crisis. And so I wanted to just get your sense, as someone who's been covering the border and immigration policy for years, of what the situation looks like now along the southern border with Mexico, and how the situation has evolved over the last few years as we've gone through, a global pandemic and a change in presidential administrations.
So to answer that question, so much of it depends on the day, to be honest, and the location. Things have changed so much since I first went to the border, so many decades ago. There's more Border Patrol agents, there's more artificial eyes on the border, more technology. Ranchers will say, there's always someone watching, no matter where we are. I've been to sheriff's offices, and you can actually see in real time people walking. You can see, have so many close eyes on the border that you can have a TV screen in the sheriff's office watching people walking out there. So that's a very big deal. When I lived in Central America in the early 90s, it was unthinkable that people would go to the Darien Gap. I mean, I wouldn't, even the Panamanian border, like spiders are this big, like, it was just, and now it's this migrant superhighway. I mean, just to get a sense of how things have changed. Smuggling, there are sophisticated smuggling operations. There are people who don't use smugglers at all. There are people for whom smuggling is electronic, just by WhatsApp and text messages, and this is the hotel you go to. There's extreme danger. I mean, it used to be people would go back and forth, and now it's very, very common to hear, and it has been for so long, but more recently, very common to hear stories about kidnappings and rapes and just, so many people coming, and for wildly different reasons. So I wouldn't want to generalize, because every time I go to the border, I come away with this. A lot of people say, well, they're all asylum seekers. That may be a quick and easy way to say that. But I don't think unless you talk to each person. And so that means there's no way to know, right? And I run into people all the time, and I'm obviously the only non-lawyer here, so, but where I'm like, okay, you could see that could be an asylum case, and other cases that it's just not. So I think it's a really complex and constantly changing situation. The one common element is that this is not. I guess as a reporter, I have a lot of questions about whether this is the way it should work, hauling children through the Darien Gap, hauling anyone through the Darien Gap, or getting them to the border where there's dangerous. It's dangerous for everyone, including us who go in. And so I think it's a very serious situation.
Andrea, and let me say before I ask you a question, actually, to our panelists, all of you are encouraged at any time, if you want to react to something that someone else has said, feel free. Like, I'm a moderator, I guess, in name, but don't want to direct the conversation and just kind of want to encourage it. But Maria, what you said about change, I guess I'd love to hear your perspective on also, because it sounds like, things look really different than they did 2 decades ago or a decade ago in some ways. And you've been in the executive branch at kind of 2 different moments. A decade ago in the Obama administration, working in the White House and DHS on the implementation of DACA, and now more recently in the National Security Council for the Biden administration. And so I'd love to hear, like, if the reality on the ground has changed a lot over time, how did you see that reflected within those administrations in terms of what folks saw as the core challenges, what their priorities were, and the like?
Sure. So thank you. It's good to be speaking with all of you here today. I was not so long ago a law student figuring out how to build a career in immigration policy, so I hope some of this is helpful. So I want to take us back to 2014, which is the first time that I worked on a sort of a border crisis, as we would call it. It really was, in some ways, one of the more recent border crises that Democrats and Republicans have dealt with. And it was when there was a significant number of unaccompanied children at the border, followed by families. They were largely Central American. And from the government's perspective, I experienced it, and I think they experienced it as sort of a shock, right? This was not something they had planned for. It was significantly different than the flow, as they would call it in government, of people who had previously been coming to the border, who were predominantly Mexicans. This is how they describe the problem set, as predominantly Mexicans, and there was a new population that is harder to process because it is easier legally to return Mexicans who come to the border. And so what's interesting about right now is there are things that feel very similar to that time when I feel like we haven't moved much beyond the same problem set of how do you process non-Mexicans, mixed flows of people at the border in an orderly way that does not result in street releases in border communities and other sort of secondary effects that we're seeing all of the time and have been seeing for the last 10 years. And I am afraid to say I don't feel like we've gotten closer to how, and when I say mixed flows, I say you have asylum seekers, you have people seeking protection, people seeking to reunite with family, people seeking to come for economic reasons. And we don't have a system that can very humanely sort through the different motivations that people are migrating. And you also have the backdrop of Congress not doing anything different in the last 10 years. And so when we came into the Biden administration, we were looking, a very similar group of people from Obama was looking at the same problem and has innovated in some really key ways I want to point out. The Biden administration did create this sort of new parole pathways for some nationalities that has allowed people, we don't really know if they would be, if they are would-be asylum seekers, but they can take this sort of safer alternative pathway. And then CBP1 is a totally different innovation. That's when you can come to a port of entry, you can sign up for an appointment, you can wait, and you can get admitted that way. These are new things, but we're still dealing with the same problem with a higher number of people coming for a number of different reasons. And so from policymakers' perspective, I think that's why you're hearing Dems starting to say we need to restrict asylum, which is much closer to Republicans, where it's why you're starting to hear them say maybe we bring back some of the Trump policies. Maybe Trump was partially correct. And that's where we are in sort of in this current policy moment.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And the particular policies, I think, like CBP1, the new parole initiatives, I definitely want to circle back to those later in the conversation as we start to think about, like, are these potential solutions? But before we get to that, I guess, building on what you just said, Ahilan, I guess, obviously a lot has changed, even as it's remained constant at the border. And obviously, the border is not all immigration policy. There's a lot that happens away from the border that's central to American immigration policy. So drawing back the lens a little bit, obviously, much of your litigation was not traditionally focused solely on border enforcement, representing people, in the interior of the country who were stuck in immigration detention for a long time, over a long period. Can you provide some perspective on, whether the challenges we face are, primarily the product of chaos at the border, or whether there are other aspects of immigration policy and immigration enforcement that have been persistent challenges in recent decades?
Yes, happy to do that. And also thanks to NYU and to everyone for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I will answer your question, but in the spirit of what you had said earlier, I want to say just one thing about what Andrea had said also, which is I want to put a pin when we come back to it in what happened with Ukrainians, because the Ukrainian refugee population or the perceived need for the United States to find a way to protect a large number of Ukrainians fleeing after Russia invaded Ukraine was part of what created the sort of internet-based application system, which undergirds the parole process that we've now several of us have talked about, that applies for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And I think it's also really interesting that that did not get talked about as a resource problem, as a border problem, as chaos. It's like 100,000 people admitted in something like 6 months. There were I can't remember, several tens of thousands admitted just in the San Diego port of entry in a single month, if I remember right. And so I do think that it's not to downplay the logistical problems that exist when you have a certain amount of government resources and you put it towards trying to kind of processing people who are coming for different reasons and from different nationalities, as you all talked about. But it's also true that the question of why it's that amount of resources and not more, which is offered, why there's political opposition to one population, not another, that also has to be interrogated. Obviously, race is playing a huge role in that, among other things. So I want to put a pin in that for when we come back to it. But yes, as you said, Adam, I mean, a huge amount of my work is focused on broadly speaking, there's 11 million undocumented people roughly in this country, and now 2/3 of that group have lived here for more than a decade. And I think there's a huge chunk, I didn't see a number about it, but I think a huge chunk have lived for 20 years. Just to give one example, you mentioned, Adam, this litigation that I've been involved in to try to stop the Trump administration's attempt to strip the status of the temporary protected status community. That's about 400,000 people who have lived here, most of them for more than 20 years, lawfully, with employment authorization under a humanitarian program. That it says is temporary, but has been extended and extended again. And now the Biden administration actually has extended it again for people from those 6 countries. So I definitely think that, and that's just one example, right? That obviously, I assume everybody here knows what DACA is, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. That's a set of people who were called immigrant youth in 2012. Now, it's 12 years later. It's a population of around 800,000 people who were given a right to sort of temporary right not to be subject to deportation enforcement and also work authorization. It's another population now that's lived here for decades, just in this kind of liminal state. And then there's other populations like that too, including some of the people who are coming through parole or asylum, who within a few years obviously end up established here, or their country is not safe for them to return. People from Ukraine, people from Afghanistan, people from many other countries in that position. And we don't have a consistent legal mechanism for allowing those people to stay here, obtain permanent residence, and then eventually a path to citizenship. Instead, they're sort of continuously in liminal states. And of course, these are just, I'm talking about sets of people who have been governmentally recognized. The majority, I think, of that 11 million number, almost all of it, I believe, doesn't include the people I've just been talking about, right? They're people who came here for, whatever various reasons, perhaps humanitarian, perhaps economic, perhaps some mix, because human motivation is complex. And they're just living here. They don't generally get targeted for enforcement if they stay outside of, away from criminal legal process, at least in most parts of the country, although not everywhere, certainly under this administration. But there is also no rule that allows those people to adjust their status. We used to have a rule, I know you know all about this, Adam, something called a registry, which periodically updated and allowed people just after a certain amount of time to register their presence here and become green card holders. We still have that rule, but it has not been updated in decades. So you have to have been here, I think, before 1972 or something, or 1973, something like that, in order to qualify for that. That date used to get periodically updated. Of course, we had Ronald Reagan's large legislation in 1986, which provided legalization or amnesty to about 3 million people. But that was the last large-scale legislative legalization program that happened. So I think that's definitely a big part of the picture. There's always been people coming here to this country, different kinds of pathways in which they came, and there were periodic ways in which those people were then allowed to obtain lawful status, and the political support for continuing those kinds of mechanisms has eroded.
Okay, so just putting together everything that everyone said so far, I feel like I'm hearing at least 3 or 4 kind of potential big challenges right now, right? We've got the significant changes in the kinds of people who have been coming to the southern border over the last decade, and maybe also changes in the numbers at different times. We've got the logistical challenges at the border, right? The problems of street release that people talk about. I mean, we're all living here in New York and experiencing what New York is going through, with the mayor concerned about the ability to provide shelter for people who are coming to the city because they're being released from processing centers at the border. So we've got all of those logistical challenges. We've got a world in which more than 10 million people are long-term residents of the country and yet don't have legal permission to reside or legal status in the country. And we're in a world where it sounds like each of you has mentioned in passing that Congress hasn't really done much in the last couple of decades to adapt to these realities. So if those are some of the challenges, and maybe I'll ask this, Ahilan, as a follow-up to you first, since you were just talking about the kind of undocumented population, like, why do you think that we've ended up in this moment? So why is it that, in the 80s, as you said, the Reagan administration signed legislation enacted by Democratic Congress to provide legal status of nearly 3 million people? That seemed possible in that period, and yet within 2 decades, we again had more than 10 million people without permission living here. So what's caused the growth of unauthorized population? What's caused the failure to respond to that over time, in your view?
So, I mean, broadly speaking, of course, it's a growing economy. The American economy, compared to other countries, has been strong, and so a lot of people have come here for economic opportunity, and that's true whether people are leaving because of humanitarian reasons, or purely for economic reasons, or for some mix of the two. So, at some basic level, people are coming here because it is a good place to live. And in addition to that, obviously, family ties play a huge role in why people come here. A lot of the people who are coming from Central America are related to people who came here a generation earlier because of conflict in Central America. I think that's less true of the Venezuelan population, but even there, I mean, whatever. There's complicated reasons, right? But underlying at some basic level, people coming because of family and because of economics, and that kind of drives it. I think. Somebody who opposes a lot of policy or legislation to do another large-scale legalization or a registry program like I was talking about earlier might say, well, what happened in the 80s was there was a deal that was struck. We legalized these 3 million people, or whatever they thought that the number would be, but we also create a system where employers are going to be punished for hiring undocumented people. And that's going to deter further immigration, and we're not going to have more illegal immigration. And that proved to be spectacularly wrong, right? In the 90s, for a variety of reasons, partly huge economic growth, also the NAFTA agreement and other reasons like that, unauthorized migration happened in very large numbers, and has continued, obviously, to happen. It's decreased as border enforcement and the eyes on the border have gotten more stringent, but it's also true that those things resulted in there being less circular migration. So people come and then they just stay, because if they go back, then they may not be able to come again. There are other changes. I don't know if it's worth getting into them, but it's become very hard to leave and adjust your status. If you out yourself because you've been unlawfully present, it's very, very difficult to then gain a pathway to permanent residence as a result of changes that came in the 90s into the immigration law. So these are legal, sort of a combinations of legal and sort of policy factors that also made that population more kind of endemic, I guess. And then the other thing I think which is important to mention is just in the last now 8 years or something like that, there is a real shift in the politics of the Republican Party on these sets of questions and in the underlying American electorate. I mean, George W. Bush advocated legalization, he didn't like, the amnesty became a bad word, but the idea that you would legalize a large significant portion of the undocumented population was championed by George W. Bush very explicitly before 9/11, but then even later, actually, a couple years later, then there was a push. So there were people in the Republican Party who favored that. Obviously, with the turn to Donald Trump, that really changed. And now the vast majority of the sort of Republican Party opposes not just amnesty, is like a dirty word. They oppose legal immigration, right? They want cuts in legal immigration, which was never the position of the sort of main conventional position of the Republican Party. I'm curious to know if you agree with that, but that's definitely my kind of read of it. And so that shift really matters. I mean, that it is now much, much harder to get any kind of bipartisan support for legislation that would have been possible before. It was hard enough, all the stars have to align in the parties and the Congress to get anything done at all. And now with this shift in the Republican Party, it's like that much harder to make it happen.
Do you want to?
Sure. So I'll try and add, I agree with so much of everything you said. I think from my perspective, I worked on the last big 2013 immigration Senate deal. And what to me has felt like has changed is Democrats' hyper-awareness of the electoral consequences of being too pro-immigrant. And so what I mean by that, and also Republicans, I think both parties have experienced that. We saw that when Eric Cantor lost his primary. So the Senate had passed this bipartisan deal. Boehner wouldn't take it up, Speaker of the House at the time. No amount of political pressure could sort of get him to change, even though he had members actively doing discharge petition and other maneuvers. And then Eric Cantor lost his primary, and he had been seen as really open to legalizing Dreamers and some of the other maybe compromised positions we could have seen come out of that. But also following that, having worked on the 2016 campaign, from the moment, Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign, it was very clear that he and his party were going to be campaigning on some very familiar anti-immigrant, xenophobic, racist tropes. And it was interesting being on a campaign side and being like, well, that's not, that's not something we have to respond to. And over time, realizing that maybe it was something we were going to need to respond to, sort of from the Clinton campaign perspective. But after that, when people were digesting, why did we lose? There's so many polls. I felt like they get kind of covered, but there was a concern that voters said they're nervous about immigration, and to me that always means we're nervous about the browning, of America or diversity. And so I do think Democrats perhaps over-adjusted from some of those poll results. And so what I remember thinking when I was sitting on the Biden transition and in the couple years before, I was like, are Democrats going to put up are they ready to be the pro-immigrant party? Are they ready to put up a full-throated defense of why we need immigration in the United States to counter a full-throated defense about why immigration was destroying America, which is what's happening. It's happening again right now. And I think it's interesting to watch what will the Biden administration do. Are they going to stay conservative? And when I mean conservative, I mean like sort of hesitant in their responses. Or are they going to be, okay, we're not going to do that. But then I think where we don't give voters enough credit is like, then what are Dems doing? And what are they doing in cities right now, right? I think I grew up in a border community, and I think for decades we have just taken for granted a little bit that border communities absorb the shock of the federal government not having a more active role in managing migration once people come to the border. And so whether, I grew up where like street releases are a thing, you get really used to it. You know that like 1,000 people are like on the street in El Paso, Texas, and that is a normal thing. Imagine how shocking that is. We're seeing how shocking it is now in places like New York and Chicago. And so we're sort of seeing like, what will Democrats do on that normal, like kind of human shock level thing that's happening? People are experiencing immigration policy in a new way right now, which means Democrats are going to have to campaign on it in a new way.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So, it sounds like in part there was a Trump effect, essentially, you're saying, and things really changed in 2016, and we can't think about politics before that moment in the same way we think about politics after that moment. And I guess I want to ask you whether nonetheless there's anything we can lessons we can take away from that before period, because I have wondered myself about, say, the politics around the 2012 election, right, where it seemed like it was a moment where, a Democratic administration, having for so long thought we're still living in the 1980s, and our job is to find a political compromise that will involve us proving our bona fides on the enforcement front in order to get buy-in from the Republican Party on more generosity in other areas, on legalization and the like. And, in the summer of 2012, the administration clearly decides, like, we've made a terrible mistake. Compromise isn't possible. That's not going to happen. And at that moment, you could have imagined the administration adopting a posture very much like the Biden administration now, a timid posture with a worry that anything that they did that stepped out in front would have cost them in the 2012 election. But instead, we kind of saw the opposite, right? The administration announces DACA and says, we're going to unilaterally provide an opportunity to protect maybe 1 million people from deportation. And I'm guessing that, that was in part because the White House in that moment thought not only that it was the right thing to do, but that also it might actually be politically beneficial to do that. And so is there any lesson from that we can take away? Are there other opportunities like that are like lying on the sidewalk that we're not picking up?
If they are, I'm looking for each and every one of them. So when we go back to 2012, for me, and it feels both personal and professional, I mean, the Latino vote was paramount to Dems, and they had seen Romney lose gains that George W. Bush had made in the years before, and that is very much seen as a demographic, like, security for Dems for a while. And it's interesting when you look at both the 2020 election results and where we are now with especially Latino voters are more and more evenly split between the parties. And so I do fear that there's been a bit of we're not going to get new voters if we're good on immigration. We'll only lose voters if we're potentially mess up on immigration. And so that's what feels really different. And also the Latino vote is simply more diverse. I always believe it's been more diverse and divided than anyone has ever tried to cover. But we're far. But what I will say, and I think this is hopeful, is for every backroom sort of Senate negotiation I got to take part of in the last year and a half since I had left the Biden administration, there were always like 10 Republican senators willing to talk. So I think a lot of the issue support is actually there. Where we got in trouble was with the leadership. So with where McConnell and where McCarthy were. But there is an idea, like maybe if we somehow break through to them eventually politically, and I think does feel like the Trump effect. Like, why would McConnell suddenly support a dream deal, even if you're significantly restricting something like asylum, if the head of their party and their candidate is going to be doing everything he's promised to do, right? But that won't always be the case. But that's why I also think Dems have to be really clear about we don't just reject what Trump's doing. Like, what is the alternative? Because Americans sort of deserve those kinds of more substantive answers.
Maria, can I come back to you on not where the Democrats maybe could go, but where they seem to be right now? So, Ahilan said that in the 1980s, the idea was, here's the deal, we'll provide legalization, but what we'll also do is increase enforcement against employers and others in order to try to solve the immigration problem. That idea seems like a pervasive one among both parties over the last couple of decades. You saw it in the Obama administration in 2014 when families started coming to the border, as Andrea said, and the Obama administration decided to start detaining families and explicitly said we need to detain families in order to deter people from coming. We saw it like when then candidate Trump talked about ending catch and release at the border. And again, the idea was that induces people to come. What we need are enforcement measures, to stop this. So if on the one hand, we're where we're at today because of the kinds of things Ahilan has talked about, like there's a lot of things that are drawing people to the United States. The other side of it is like, what is law and law enforcement doing about this? And I think some have the view that the problem is basically we're failing to enforce like aggressively enough. Like if we could only come up with sufficiently aggressive enforcement measures, detain people for prolonged periods at the border, block access to protection if they come through irregular routes, that's what the Biden administration is doing, then we'll manage to persuade people not to come. You've spent like years talking to migrants, thinking about this process. And so I guess I'm really interested in your perspective on like, to what extent does that view get things right? And to what extent does it get things wrong in terms of understanding like what's going to shape migration?
In terms of enforcement?
Yeah, like are migrants going to stop coming if we detain them for long periods? Or are people basically unaffected by the choices that the government's making along the border?
Well, I mean, wow, do I have a lot to say about this? So, I mean, just to go back to 86, right? So if you go back and you look at the clips from 1986 or read, Kamasaki wrote a great book about immigration reform, the corpse that never dies, which is so accurate. The news media was reporting then that the system wasn't going to work. Mm-hmm. And within, I think, months, if not, for the next few years, people were selling fake papers on the street corners in LA. It was very clear that that Ronald Reagan had signed a bill into law that wasn't going to really crack down on immigrants. And when you think of all kind of the shock and awe policies, of immigration, when George W. Bush went into, carried out immigration raids, which I covered, and what the Trump administration did and all the scary things. I mean, at the end of the day, it was maybe 2% of immigrants were getting deported. So your odds are really good that you're going to get to stay forever. I mean, everybody knows that if you make it into the country, you're probably not going to get deported unless you get arrested for something. Could be running a stop sign, could be driving without a license, could be something much more serious. And ICE doesn't have the numbers to go searching for everybody, in spite of all the scary things that some folks were saying recently in the papers about what they're planning to do. So I don't think, but at the same time, you saw just since the United States announced that it was going to start deporting again to Venezuela, you saw a sharp drop in Venezuelans at the border, and you've seen similar, incredible drops for Cubans and Haitians at the border because of that threat. And part of that is because a lot of those folks have fled to other places, and they don't want to go directly to the country they left or fled, which where they could face real danger. or just, extreme poverty. So that's one thing a lot of the Republicans, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, they would say, we'd like immigration reform, but this amnesty you promised us didn't work. Now we have 3 times as many undocumented immigrants. It was supposed to fix it once and for all. There's a big question about whether that's ever going to be possible, and that's what it was supposed to happen. By the way, registry. The last person I know who was eligible for registry was President Barack Obama's uncle, because he had been here since he was a teenager. So it was really, it was really, an unbelievable amount of time this has been going on. Now, but I do think something that is generally overlooked, because it really isn't a problem for lawyers, but it is a problem for the public and the media, which is understanding this system. Is that people, will look at some of the things Trump is laying out and saying, oh, well, you can't do that. That's illegal, or that's not going to happen, or that will be stopped. And it's like, but immigration system is generally secret, for all our purposes. Like, I can't do my basic job and go to immigration court and pull a file. Like, there's no pacer for immigration court. I can't find out who they arrested yesterday. And people will say, maybe people on the panel, that it's to protect immigrants, but if you're deporting someone to a place where they're telling a judge they could be killed, and there's no real public oversight of that, I have a lot of questions about that as a journalist. So when people, family separation, for example, people would say, well, that's not supposed to happen, and judge declared it unlawful preliminarily, but it did happen, and nobody knew. Why didn't we know about that right away? It's because we can't find out who got arrested yesterday. And that really matters. The way they found the plaintiffs, they went to federal court where people were being criminally charged for crossing the border illegally, and asked them one by one, is that was your child taken? So, so all these things, when I read those stories about what, if elected Trump wants to do or someone else wants to do, Biden, that's the first thing that crosses into my mind. Where are people being sent? Who's getting arrested? And why can't we find out about it? So that enforcement system, one last thing, I'm sorry, if you don't mind. Just a few days ago, I got kicked out of an immigration courtroom in Chicago, where the judge, I was going to try to see how this fast-track deportation program was going. And I go unannounced, like I would to any regular criminal civil courtroom. And I walk in, and there's a mom and a dad and a little kid in their lap. And the judge said, oh, this is private, and he asked the immigrants, do you want this to be private or public? And I was like, that's not really how I would ask it. You're trying to deport them. They don't have a lawyer. And they said, oh, no, private. And he closed the door, and he ordered them deported. And I can't find them. And I don't know what happened to them. I don't know where they are now. I don't know if they're safe. And neither does anyone in the public. And so that kind of stuff really matters. And that's how this system runs, this enforcement system. So even if it's 2%, there's a real problem with public oversight of it and finding out what happens. So thanks for letting me say all that. So.
I have a follow-up question, but Ahilan, do you want to, as someone who's also kind of worked inside the enforcement system, do you want to reflect on any of that as well?
No, I mean, just on the particular point you're raising, I'm not somebody who would defend that system. I actually think it's a huge problem, what you describe, and there are arguments to be made for the privacy of asylum cases and the privacy of cases involving children. But there are also a number of ways of accommodating those that would allow greater transparency than exists now. And yeah, I think you're entirely right that that if the system were more transparent, it wouldn't be sufficient to kind of make it rational and function like a fair and just court system, but it would help in a huge way. And I mean, until recently, actually, I think it might still be true. For a long time anyway, there was literally no way even to get the decisions of immigration courts and even the appellate body unless they were published, and there's a minuscule number that were published. I haven't tracked this carefully. There's certain changes that have just happened so that some of that is better than it used to be, but it's extraordinarily opaque compared to what you would think of as a normal court system. But go ahead, you should.
Yeah.
Well, first, I guess autobiographically, I just want to join you by noting that back in the day before I was an academic, the very first non-citizen who I represented was a person who'd been ordered deported and was appealing their deportation order. I was a lawyer in New York. They were detained in California, and I, submitted a notice of appearance in their case to the court. And that night, at like 2 a.m, at the number, my cell phone that I had like listed on the appearance, like I got a phone call from an INS agent saying, "Well, we're deporting your client to Tijuana tonight." And I said, "Well, who are you?" And the person wouldn't give their name, wouldn't explain like where they were releasing my client, and it took 3 days to like sort that out. And it's because even for lawyers representing people, oftentimes connections to your client or information from the government is hard to come by. But circling back to the point you made about the low probability that people who actually manage to make it here are ultimately going to be deported, and the way that it shapes how effective enforcement can be or whether it can be effective, that seems powerful and important. And then when you add to that the secrecy of the system and how it operates, it's hard to imagine how anybody knows what's going to happen in their cases. And yet you also said, like, when the government announces we're going to start removing people to Venezuela, for example, like the number of Venezuelans approaching the border drops dramatically, at least in the short term. And so so I'm super interested in what your sense is of what's going on there, because when I see the way that immigration gets reported, so I guess this is close to like the journalistic side of this, is that in those moments, it's often reported that these changes are the product of these policies. And I often find myself wondering both like, well, how did the immigrants even know about these policies? Like, how fast is awareness traveling through these smuggling networks or through other information networks? And also, do I really believe that these movements and the kind of rates at which people are coming are being driven by X, Y, or Z policy?
For me, there's like two. I mean, it's way more complex than this, but for simplicity, there's the border, and then there's people like who have been here for 20, 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those folks, the people who have been here a long time, are so frustrated every time I go talk to them about the emphasis on the border. And they've just, I remember I went to Eastern Washington State for a story about a town where immigrants had been there. It's the apple picking, where they come America's apple basket. And it's, and they've been here for so long, and that the town's adults were like the vast majority was 98% Latino, but most of the city officials were white because Latinos couldn't vote. They were all non-citizens. And so it was this fascinating place, and where people were just completely disenfranchised. And so, you see where people have been here, they're to me, people seem very well informed. They know how the United States works. If you deport them to their home country, they don't know how to get stuff done. They don't know about a bank account. They're neither from here or there, they'll say. And so they've, for me, that's a really important group of people I've tried to focus on as well. It's very difficult with all the emphasis on the border and all the policies changing, from the border. And then there's folks coming from the border who have been told by somebody, who are either fleeing for their lives and think the only place they can be safe is the United States, or someone's told them, like sometimes they'll have the names and addresses written on their hands or in their arms, and they have a brother somewhere in New York or a cousin or a boyfriend, somewhere, and they want to come and join them. And what's really fascinating, all this stuff you're seeing in New York and Chicago and all these shelters, I mean, what for me has been really fascinating is that this system generally has been self-run by migrants for many, many years. I mean, you definitely see in the border cities people getting released, and you'll see a lot of pileups at the bus stations and things like that. But that has been happening. But generally, you just call your cousin, they'll buy you a plane ticket or a bus ticket, and you're gone. I mean, you have a place to go, and they finance it. They put you up, they shelter you, they pay for your food, they get you a job, and you're working within the week. But this system, like a lot of people with the Venezuelans coming and others, I mean, they really don't have those kinds of contexts yet. That will change probably in the coming years. But and that's why you're seeing people backed up in the shelters. And they also come from a different government system, a more authoritarian system where the government tells you what to do and has these structures set up for you. And that's, I think it's fascinating that people are so focused on the work permits, because a lot of people, are making $35 an hour in the Midwest working construction, and they don't need work permits, So it's a really interesting situation what's going on right now with all the different kinds of people. So.
Yeah, if I could just quickly respond to that. You asked
absolutely.
about the numbers and how you sort of read this back and forth of like flights happen, numbers go down. One thing that's been frustrating in my own policy career, and there's many smart people who think this, but like when our only metric is the number of unauthorized migrants at the border every single day, then what's happened is both Dems and Republicans have chased policies that will make that dip go down. And so even the last 10 years, I've been bombarded with like, well, the Remain in Mexico program made it decrease by X percentage. And then I'm like, okay, but what happened on month 4? Or like Title 42 did this at this point. And then I'm like, what happened at month 5, right? And so it's a horrible way to set policy, because you are just chasing the next thing to get the temporary dip, to get the story that now the Biden admin has fixed the Venezuela problem, when I think those of us who've been working the space for a long time know that that's not at all indicative of the health of your immigration system. Everything, I agree with everything you guys have said about sort of the secrecy of the immigration like removal process. And it's really frustrating as people who care about immigration, like you almost have to like become a border expert. But when our metric is what it is, then I'm sure there's going to be another announcement following the Venezuelan deportation flights that's more enforcement oriented, and they'll get another short-term dip. And then there could be a storm, and there could be a mass migration at the border, right? And does that mean that everything else was a failure? That's kind of how we've been treating it. We've basically been treating everything that's predated these mass migration moments as policy failures, and they get taken off the table. So I think it's really hard for those of you thinking about going into government and working on this to be like, everything is dictated by the numbers. And if we could just move beyond that in some way, I think we'd see very different policymaking.
One other thing I'll add to that is I feel like the unspoken premise of that debate you're talking about, which is, it's so strange to me, but it really is like the undergirding unspoken premise, is that immigration itself is bad, right? Like there's the one thing to say it is a logistical problem, certainly at this level of government resources, to deal with, bunch of street releases, a population that doesn't have a family to go to, Venezuela. Millions of people have left Venezuela, right? It is a huge chunk of this particular phenomena that we're in now, and it's different in a variety of ways. I think my sense is, from seeing some stuff about this, and certainly my own experience representing children, very few Salvadoran or Guatemalan or Honduran people who are coming here are coming to no family, right? Whereas Venezuelans are really in a sort of a different situation for that reason. But sort of more generally, that presents certain logistical problems. But it's also true that the demographic makeup of the United States is shifting, is growing older. You see these stories. There was a story about Vermont recently, and we saw that about how it's really a huge problem that there's like not enough younger people in Vermont. The average age is now 42 or something like that. And when you get upside down demographics, you get all kinds of problems. You need to like make robots to do things that it's all this stuff, and that exists and it's out there in the world. And yet simultaneously, constantly, the kind of rhetoric is like, what can we do to decrease the number of people coming? And it's so I don't understand that. And I'm neither a reporter nor somebody who works regularly, certainly from within, on the inside of the political space. I don't understand why it is that there's nobody who just says, like, of course, there's a logistical problem that comes anytime you have a number of people coming, and they're coming in this way. Sure, it would be better, all else being equal, to have people come in some other way that would not create those same logistical problems. But this is a good thing. The country needs more people. I even saw stuff saying that if New York hadn't taken a lot of, over time, the immigrant populations over the last several years, that it might have looked a lot more demographically like Detroit in terms of the kind of hollowing out of the urban core and loss of labor, labor workforce. And like, where is that in the political discourse? There's nobody saying that. And also, I don't feel like that many stories connecting those two things together, occasionally, but they seem so obviously connected to me. So that's just like a perpetual mystery for me as I look out into the space.
I think it's a racial issue, and I think you mentioned that, but when we talk about fixing logistical problems, we didn't have a Ukrainian border crisis, but we did technically have a Ukrainian border crisis, right? You had 20,000 people that Department of Homeland Security figured out how to process in very quickly and quietly. So but I had sort of lived through what happened in Del Rio, Texas, when you had over 10,000 Haitians, and you could imagine a very different response. Actually, now we know the alternative response, and so we are still wrestling, which is why you'll hear me say yet again, like if Democrats, I think, have an opportunity to kind of make the exact argument, like we have arguments, I think, that can change the policy space, but we have to be comfortable with saying, like, we are arguing for more diversity to fill our labor shortage. And there's like kind of a piecing together of those two things.
So I would love to build from that. Like we can't solve the politics of it today, probably, but I did promise that we have space for optimism. And so, both of you are talking about, ways that we could be on the front foot in thinking about opportunities that come from the situation and solutions to these problems, as opposed to just, doubling down on the effort to enforce our way out of the challenges that the system has given us today. And so I guess to come back to you, Andrea, you came into the White House at the start of the Biden administration, obviously thinking intently about these border challenges and being a big part of spearheading, in fact, an enormous success, right? Bringing, something like 13,000 people who'd been returned to Mexico under a Trump administration policy called Remain in Mexico, asylum seekers waiting for their asylum hearings, and without, chaos or political crisis, you and the administration managed to parole those 13,000 folks into the country, and that seemed like a big success. And I know that you've also, spoken publicly after leaving the administration about the fact that you felt like there were opportunities on the table that weren't happening, or that you wished would have happened, more quickly. And so, what do you think we should do?
So I think, I admire in some ways the way that the Biden administration has course corrected since I left. I left because I figured that we were going to become embroiled in the which Trump policy do we bring back, because that will fix the border. And this sort of framework that was like, there's one single thing we can do that will fix mass migration, which I think is such a wrong way to look at the problem. But I've been impressed. One thing that's hard in government is you do have to try new things, but obviously there should be scrutiny on trying new things. But sometimes also it's a hard balance, right? Because you want the government to try a new process and actually see if it starts to work. And I say that to say I think their parole pathways are really interesting and have perhaps led to a more significant drop in the unauthorized immigration they're trying to decrease than anything I've seen in the last 10 years. Where I quibble with it is it's still it's restricted to certain nationalities, right? I don't understand how you can say a Guatemalan migrant didn't come the right way when there's no real alternatives other than waiting potentially maybe over a year for CBP1 appointment, right? You have to create the legal alternatives if you want a framework that says that's a carrot and stick, where the carrot has to be big enough to balance the stick. And so I think they're moving in that direction. I want them to move more aggressively, but I will tell you something that actually kind of gave me some hope in the last year. I think in '96 and Clinton era, there was this idea that if you just make the lives of immigrants so miserable, they'll stop coming. And so one way to do that was to prevent, say, asylum seekers from working, right? To make work authorization really hard to obtain. And it's really interesting to see all these city leaders, congressional, state leaders now saying, isn't it insane that we don't let people work legally once we have as a US government have given them permission, whether they're in removal proceedings or not, to work? Right. So I'm seeing an interesting challenge of this old idea of deterrence, where a deterrence is to make immigrants as miserable or as possible. And I think that's an interesting political shift. And you saw a huge redesignation for Venezuelans for TPS. I can't tell you probably how much the administration may not have wanted to do that. And that is 400,000 plus people who are going to have a very different life now in the US. Those things give me hope, and those things that the administration has been doing and considering. But I think because some of these things around how we think about immigrants in our communities are changing, I don't want to be overly optimistic because it's not my nature, but that has provided some comfort.
Ahilan, I mean, I guess following directly on that, we focused mostly on kind of what the federal government's doing. And Andrea's talking about, TPS extension for Venezuelans, 400,000 people, gives them work authorization. And those of us in New York know, like, oh, part of the push for that came from the city of New York, repeatedly saying,
And the state.
and the state saying there are many, many people coming to New York who need the ability to work to sustain themselves. Otherwise, they're going to rely on the government for support. And so it does seem like, in an interesting way, there are some new roles being played by cities and states in thinking about these challenges. And I know you've been working on this stuff, so do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, I've been working a lot on a particular campaign in the University of California, which is try to get the University of California to open student employment opportunities to the undocumented students who do not have DACA, because now almost all of the undocumented students entering higher education at this point are not eligible for DACA. I mean, either because both, I guess, because the court decisions have basically stopped the processing of all new applicants for DACA, and also because to be eligible for DACA, you have to have been in the country prior to June 15, 2007, which means that most young people coming now, even though they've lived here their whole life and went to school here and all that, they sort of fit the very typical quote unquote dreamer profile. They actually are not eligible for DACA because they came here too late. And now there's actually something like, I think, 40,000 undocumented students who do not have DACA in California in higher education. There's something like 20,000 graduating high school every year. And there's several 100,000 across the nation in this position. And there's really a campaign. There's a campaign called the Opportunity for All campaign, which is trying to get the University of California to do this. The legal theory underlying it is based on this idea that the law that we've now come up a bunch of times in this panel, the 1986 law, that the Reagan-era law that provided the legalization for 3 million documented people, that law also created the employer sanctions regime, which made it a crime for employers to knowingly hire undocumented people, and also imposed a civil fines regime and all that. Extraordinarily under-enforced law, which, from whether it's Washington or anywhere else you can look at. In fact, I know, Adam, you've talked about and written about how the decision to allow this large undocumented population to exist in the United States is itself a policy choice. It's a choice about how you choose to do enforcement. But we've sort of analyzed that law and looked at it very carefully and seen that it does not clearly state that it applies to state governments when they act as employers. And as a result, I think there's a very strong legal argument now has been endorsed publicly by a bunch of legal scholars in immigration and federalism, stating that the law does not apply to state governments when they act as employers, which means, I mean, in the short term, it means that the University of California, which is an arm of the state of California, can open its employment opportunities to undocumented students, but it also means, sort of extended, that other kinds of state government jobs could also be open that way. That's one thing I'm working a lot on. It's just one example of, I think, a whole lot of measures that we have seen and that are now kind of, I think, ripe to expand. On the one hand, you have Texas passing a criminal trespass law, which really, has it passed, by the way? I was trying to figure this out. I know it was like proposed.
It hasn't been signed.
It has, okay.
Yeah.
It's sitting in this really odd position, right? But the law as written appears to authorize Texas state officials to essentially deport people. This is just one example of a whole raft of very sort of hostile legislation passed in Texas and Florida, building on history of this. But then on the sort of counterweight side, you've got states that are more friendly towards immigrants passing things like making professional licenses open to undocumented people, obviously driver's licenses, for years in-state tuition, which basically means that undocumented young people can be treated like residents of that state for purposes of getting access to higher education. Health insurance. California now has health insurance available to all people regardless of immigration status. And there's sort of a suite of these kinds of proposals that have the effect of creating, they do not create legalization. They cannot do what the federal government can do, which is sort of guarantee that you're not going to get deported if or either if you don't commit a crime or ever, but they do go a long way to establishing the conditions for immigrant inclusion. They make it more possible for immigrants and then certainly for their children to gain better access to economic and social opportunity in the country. And in a world where, as you say, it's really hard to enforce against more than 2% or 3% of the population anyway, these are meaningful ways that they're not what, in my view, is sort of what should be normatively required and what the tradition was, which is just legalization, full stop. But they are paths to get there that state and local governments can pursue in an era of, the era we've been kind of talking about. So yeah, I'm very interested in, and I'm very optimistic about those, particularly as you get, more partisan polarization on these sets of issues. It means that places which are sort of more pro-immigrant at the state and local level can push for more aggressively pro-immigrant policies. And what happened in New York, to me, is an example of that. I mean, it's partly, for sure, driven by the actual logistical problem that you were saying about what happens when you have all this people coming here with insufficient resources, but it's also created by the fact that there's not a political cost to being like more pro-immigrant than the Biden administration is if you're the governor of New York or the mayor of New York City. And that is certainly true in California and in a bunch of other states as well.
And do you think, so, the Venezuelan example obviously is an example where that local advocacy appears to have had some effect on the decision-making of the White House. Do you think there are other opportunities like that where not only can states and local governments go their own way, but they can actually change the kind of national political conversation we're having? Because I'm kind of wondering, can we get to Andrea's point where the Democratic Party, say nationally, could get more on the front foot, and like what would be the conditions that would lead to that?
I guess I'm not. I would defer to both these others to like what it is that causes Democratic political officials to change their kind of perceptions of things. To me, it seemed obvious that like deporting children without giving them lawyers, and allowing them to have a day in court was the kind of thing that surely Democratic officials would be able to get behind. And yet that policy remained constant, from the Obama administration through Trump to the Biden administration. So I'm not sure. It's really, really hard to say. I think one other thing I think matters is that in New York and California, both, of course, the politicians are national. They're national politicians. The governor of California, in just a week or something from now, sometime, a little bit longer, but is going to be debating the governor of Florida in like this on November 30th, I think, where he's going to be debating the governor of Florida in this national debate. So obviously, immigration politics in California is in part inflected by that, and obviously that's true of New York as well. So I'm not sure what it would take. Certainly, if you can. You would think if there's a challenge that would come from the, left or, from a more openly pro-immigrant side, you've got to believe that would shift, the Biden administration and the sort of core of the Democratic Party. But beyond that, I'm not sure when it happens and when it doesn't.
Do you have any reactions?
I think there's a lot of potential if governors like Pritzker and the upcoming perhaps like Democratic convention in Chicago could be another like motivating event. But basically, I think these governors and mayors should sort of keep it up. Because a lot of their requests are things that border communities have been asking for a very long time. Like something as simple as, could you get a bus from CBP to drop people off at a shelter versus a bus station? And they're like, no. But they definitely have a legal authority to do that. And that's like one example. Like right now, there was a week where in 7 days, Governor Abbott sent 62 buses to Chicago. And that is a state that is now intaking with like no intervention support, help from the federal government, an unknowable number of people that Governor Abbott's not saying like, here's who's on this bus. This is what they need. There's none of that. They are just dropping them off. And the idea that the federal government continues to play no role in that is sort of, it's a little confounding when you see other nations or create real reception around newly arrived people, especially if they don't have financial sponsors or housing, which is why that population is more logistically challenging. And cities are kind of going above and beyond, I think, but we have a real opportunity, I think, to build something that we're going to need for, say, climate migration. It's almost a resilience issue now. It's like, how are you managing newly arrived people who need more services? That we have to start answering that question. And it can't be that, like, we just keep relying on Governor Abbott to sporadically decompress border communities, which is actually, I think, a federal government function and one I will continue to push for. And I think the governors and states could kind of change that entirely.
Well, I want to make sure that we reserve some time for questions from you all. And I see we've only got about 10 minutes left. So if anyone has a question, I think because we're live streaming the event, I would just ask that you come to one of the microphones on either side of the stage so that audience members who are not physically present will be able to hear you. So we would all welcome any questions that you all have.
Thank you all. Just one question about the legal pathways approach we're seeing from the administration. Was that an idea that came up regularly during the transition? Was that an idea that had been broached before in policy conversations? Like, what's the sort of genealogy of that particular idea?
I think you might know this in some ways better. From my perspective, there had long been a discussion of, we have this sacred sort of right to seek asylum wherever you reach a point on U.S. territory. And there had been discussions, though, that like in our policy design, do we really want families, young children, having to sort of trek through dangerous smuggling routes to access that right and that protection? And I think on transition, we were starting to say, what are some safer ways that we can channel people outside of like the cartel smuggling networks? Can people come to airports? Can we make it easier for them to do that? Can they go to consulates? So those were sort of the discussions we were having about it. And I can't say that I know fully like how they got from a place where, when we were winding down Remain in Mexico, we were testing out the CBP1 app for that process. But they went actually very far from that, where even then they wanted it to be very slow. Like I remember reporting up the numbers and being like 100 people came in today. And eventually I stopped reporting those numbers because it almost felt like even that was stressing out some decision makers. But they went from that to saying, we're going to let in 1,450 people a day at ports, right? That's a pretty big shift. And I do think some very smart people have been pressuring them to think about what I said at the beginning. It's like, we can do humanitarian protection, but what's maybe even a safer way to do it than have people come sort of by sea or by land? And it's hard because you still want to protect that right, and I do protect that right, but it's almost like, how are you preserving the border asylum system for the most vulnerable people who make it there? And the idea that we want people, we've kind of designed the system where people do have to go through the Darien to access our immigration system. And so that's why I think sort of legal pathways are the future, and why I'm really happy that they embrace that concept.
And the only thing I would add to that is, Adam wrote a book about this, but there's a very, very long history of parole being used to bring in populations of people who are entirely abroad, from Hungarians in the 50s to tons of people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and on. I mean, so many examples like that. I know in the transition there were a lot of discussions about parole, expanding the use of parole, both for people already here, parole in place as they call it, and also, as you were saying, for people who are abroad in different ways. But all that being said, to me, the sort of part of the key innovation that makes the CHND program, the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela program, more successful than prior forms of parole is the application process itself. The fact that it can be done online, that it can be done through a sponsor. It's much more accessible in that way than prior parole programs. And those parts of it are directly modeled on Ukraine. There's a cap, the number of people, which was not present for Ukraine. As you were saying, like the stick part was, either not present at all or at least very, very minimal with respect to Ukraine compared to as to these countries. But I don't think it would have happened if not for a huge amount of pressure. I mean, first, Ukraine happened because it was like, oh, of course, we have to do this. Not to go on the hobby horse a little bit, Afghanistan happened just a few months before Ukraine. And the Afghanistan program was an abject failure after the first couple. It worked okay for the first couple of months, and then it just completely disappeared. And even to this day, thousands of people who were allied with the United States who face tremendous risk of harm from the Taliban are still stuck in Afghanistan. The government took millions of dollars in fees all through this paper process where you had to apply individually. I mean, there's so many ways in which the Afghan program was so deficient compared to the Ukraine program, which came just a few months later. But then once that Ukraine program was in place, I think it was easier to pressure the administration to say, how can you do this only for Ukraine? I mean, the racism is so obvious here. You have to do something to try and equalize this. And that played a role. You know, I don't know the exact, but I certainly think that played a role in creating the political space or kind of forcing them to do the same thing for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I just have a question. I know a couple times the sort of intersection between the criminal legal system and the immigration legal system came up briefly. And I was just wondering if you wanted to share any further thoughts on that, and particularly, I don't know, some of the optimism that may be felt in other areas of the system, I struggle to feel in change in that intersection, because so often the rights of immigrants who face challenges in the criminal legal system are kind of traded off in some of these political conversations. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts to share about that.
I feel like I'm dominating the thing, but I do have thoughts on that. I mean, represent a bunch of people like that. I mean, one thing I will say is that that's an area where state and local government really has a lot of control, because it's very, very difficult for the government to arrest and detain and deport people coming out of the criminal legal system unless there is some level of cooperation between state and local law enforcement and federal immigration. So I actually feel quite, in relative terms, optimistic about that, because I actually think, the policy levers are there. And you see in California, for example, the reality is, like, if you were convicted of a drug possession offense under the Obama administration and you were a non-citizen, you know, even a green card holder, you were much more likely to be deported and detained and deported than if the same thing happened to you under the Trump administration in California. And the reason for that is because California passed very aggressive sanctuary measures, non-cooperation measures after the election that advocates had tried for years to get passed before the election. They couldn't get the political support for it. But then as soon as Trump came to power with all this rhetoric, now there was all this move against it. And I think that is something that has been modeled in different places. Also expanded legal representation, like here in New York, which is amazing. It's like, you know, the paradigm example. I definitely think more can be done to push those models in other parts of the country. But that is something where I feel much more optimistic, because I feel like you don't actually have to shift that much of federal policy to have a bottom line kind of change. The one thing I'll say about that is another thing which confounds me, although I think perhaps race explains this as well. Adam, you did a study, and then now the study has been replicated multiple times, showing that immigration enforcement statistically does not decrease crime. There are multiple studies that show this. Even enforcement targeted at people, trying to detain and deport people convicted of crimes, it does not actually decrease crime. And there's very good empirical studies like yours on the subject. And I feel like that, it doesn't get said as much as it should get said. And so I think there's also some political space there. Of course, many rational things don't happen for kind of other reasons, but I do think that's an argument that can be made at the state and local level to help push those kinds of policies further.
I think we have time for one, maybe final short question.
Thank you so much for coming to NYU Law School. We're so thrilled to have each of you. I wanted to pick up on Andrea's point about climate migration. Are any of you seeing any serious policy attempts to include climate migrants in asylee status, or to address what we see as an emerging trend?
I think a lot of the bipartisan support for restricting asylum access right now is due in part to the fear of climate migration. So there's already this perception that, like, too many fraudulent asylum claims go into the asylum system and it's overwhelmed and it's broken and it's backlogged. But it's interesting. I do think maybe for, like, policymakers, it's easier to talk about, okay, well then, like, let's tighten that up, rather than start to talk about if you're going to have a processing system at the border for climate migrants, and we still have a system where most people have to come by foot to access our immigration system, which is just sort of where climate migrants will likely fall, then you have to have really serious conversations about eligibility requirements beyond the grounds for asylum, right? Like, you're going to have to think about adding new eligibility to enter the United States. And that right now in our political space feels very difficult when you see Democrats right now at the table, right, like today, talking about how do we further restrict asylum, right? We're going in a bit of an opposite direction. Now, I don't know, and it's sort of, and we're so nationality-based in our immigration system for a lot of different historical legal reasons, and so maybe we're fine with climate migrants from certain countries and not others, right? It's actually why I think in my own work I'm trying to push us against some of the nationality-based, because I think with climate migration you have to get to a system that can adjudicate a large number of immigration applications much faster and for a much more diverse population. And I just sort of think that's what we inevitably have to build. But I do think we're heading in the opposite direction right now.
Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.